It's really great to see so many colleagues here. My name's Paul Stevens. I'm the editor for Psychology and Linguistics at what's now known internally as Palgrave Education. We publish textbooks across a very wide range of subjects for students all around the world. And one such book is this, Minding the Brain, a book which I think is fair to describe as a very adventurous and imaginative and in its way a very groundbreaking guide to the relationship between neuroscience and philosophy. And its author, Professor Georg Northoff, a neuroscientist, philosopher and psychiatrist, who's based at the University of Ottawa, has very kindly taken time out of his always very hectic travel schedule to come and speak to us today, and to take us on what he promises to be a neurophilosophical adventure trip. So there'll be a Q&A at the end, but for the time being, I will hand over to Georg, and let's all enjoy the journey.
Yeah, thank you very much for introducing, and thank you very much for coming on, and thank you very much for the excellent collaboration with you, Paul. Yeah, I start the talk with a question which maybe for neuroscientists may be rather strange, because usually scientists in general ask the question, how does science function? You know, the what is the domain of the philosopher. And here I put something together which is already somehow strange, because usually you assume you know what the brain is, you just don't know how it functions. But I raised the question, what is the brain? And some of you may know the movie. And a famous philosopher, Arthur Schopenhauer, 19th century, from Germany, and you can hear already from my accent, obviously, I'm originally German, can't hide it. He said that the brain is just a gray pulpy gruesome device. And then, of course, the question is, how is it possible that your brain is somehow involved in making possible all these colorful experiences you have? Like, for instance, maybe, oh God, now he's talking about again the brain, you have some sense of boredom, and oh God, and your mind is drifting over it. So how is that possible? Because no brain imager has so far found any of these experiences in the colorful dots and spots in the brain, which you often see, I'm sure you know what these brain images. So this is basically the question of the talk. How are mental features like your sense of self or consciousness are related to the brain? And is the brain just a gray, pulpy, gruesome device? So let me go very briefly into the history of the philosophy, history of neuroscience. So you see already Freudian lapses. So the brain has often been considered as a pure reflex apparatus. So like a car. You go into your garage, your car's standing there, you take the key, you open the door, and you push the gas pedal and the car moves. So they're basically like a reflex. It goes back to Charles Sherrington, famous neuroscientist from your part of the world. And sort of this model is still very prevalent in current cognitive neuroscience. Let me just briefly illustrate how it works. What we call in neuroscience stimulus, you may call it a painting. I returned it before I went over to Canada, to the museum in Oslo. And that sort of is supposed to induce some activity in the brain. And this is what we call stimulus-induced or task-evoked activity. So I hope this is what you now is going on in your brain. When you watch this, you have sort of some activity in your brain. I hope so. And that basically means your brain itself has no say in what happens in the brain. So everything is usually associated with the stimulus or the task. So this is basically presupposed when you have these dramatic reports, all moral judgment is related to that and that brain region. Now it's more the networks. This network is related to abstract reasoning or shopping, all kinds of things. That's the model. However, in this, there has been an alternative model of the brain. And this is basically now by some other authors, which is more on the sidelines and has resurfaced more recently in neuroscience. Some of you might have heard that the detection of the default mode network is a special network in the middle of the brain. I which shows particular high level of spontaneous activity. Meaning, even if there's no particular extrinsic stimulus or task. So imagine, you again go into your garage, and what do you see? Your car moves. You think, I'm crazy. No. Maybe you want to call me as a psychiatrist, but your car moves. And what does this mean? You have to adapt now to the movements of the car in order to enter the car. You cannot just go straight to the car. You have to observe and watch, but you have to adapt if you want to enter the car. Say now, with the extrinsic stimulus. You have some intrinsic activity. And with that, you approach the stimulus. Meaning, it's a very daily experience. So today you see maybe this painting, you're in Oslo, and you're in a very good mood, and it doesn't drag you down, you really enjoy it. Next day, you get a very bad message, maybe something happens bad, and you're in a very misery mood, you slept badly and everything, and then you see this painting, same painting, and you experience it completely different. The painting hasn't changed, only your intrinsic. So what we observe then is stimulus-induced activity, what as we call it, or task-evoked activity, is basically a mixture. A mixture between what the stimulus itself does to the brain and what the brain itself does to the stimulus. So it's basically, imagine you're entering the garage and you have to adapt, and the better you adapt, the more likely that you can enter the car and move the damn thing. Yeah? So meaning, your brain has a very strong say in what happens with the brain. So it sort of can contain the stimulus or the task you have to do. Yeah? And this is very important. You will see throughout my talk, there's strong evidence that this intrinsic activity has a central role in transforming a purely neuronal state into a mental state. So that's really the guiding hypothesis, and that I will show you by a lot of data that makes possible self and consciousness. And that has major philosophical implications, because it sort of may force us to revise some of our often more implicit or tacit ideas about this mental state. So I hope that already somehow makes it clear. So are self and consciousness in the brain? This is the usual title you have often heard. Maybe the question mark is often replaced by an exclamation mark. But I leave that as an important thing. And what do I mean by adventure trip here? I really mean that you get into some of the functioning of the way the brain works, and the data sort of may force you to rethink about how the brain works, and then also to rethink about some of our philosophical concepts. So I will try to take you on the road with me. I hope you follow. And then you can decide at the end whether it was an adventure or was just a very boring dream. Okay, let me start with some of our early empirical findings, 2006. So there are many studies in the imaging world. So fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, where you can basically, people are in the scanner and they have to online perform a task or expose to certain stimuli. And you can present stimuli which are personally relevant or non-personally relevant. For instance, a personally relevant stimulus for you all, I assume, is, let's say, a picture of London, foggy weather, somehow wet, little drizzle. So this is for you highly self-relevant. Whereas if I present you a picture of Ottawa, clear blue sky, but minus 40 degrees, that may not be so relevant. Whereas for me, it's the other way around. Because I'm not so often in London, but I have to survive in Ottawa also. So when you compare these kind of two stimuli, personally relevant or self-related, versus personally non-relevant, non-self-related, this is what you see. You see a certain involvement of brain regions in the middle of the brain. So basically when you know that you have two halves in your brain, when you slice the brain into two halves, and this is basically what you see. And that raises the question, are these regions specifically involved for the self? No, because many other processes, like social processes, if you have empathy, social embedment, meditation, consciousness, also involves these regions. And one very peculiar thing, these regions also show high resting state activity, so in the absence of any particular stimulus. So now, let me show. Yourself, I assume that all of you share the view with me that the self is somehow important. When you wake up in the morning, you look at the mirror, yeah, this is me. And those who do not experience that sense of me, then you have a problem. Let's say, if you say, hey, I'm Jesus. I am. Then you might get the diagnosis of schizophrenia. So that tells you your sense of self can change. And that must be somehow related to your work. Okay. So, what I want to show, yourself is very important. I want to show my talk, I show you some results on the self when you make a decision. Whether you want to stay in London, drizzling weather, 5 degrees, or go to Ottawa, snowstorm, minus 40 degrees. Yeah? So which airplane ticket shall I buy? Then I want to show you some data on the self and the spontaneous activity. And then last but not least, the most difficult, which usually drives me completely crazy, self-consciousness. And I show you some data. I show you in part also some findings from neurology, and then I will sort of also indicate the conceptual philosophical implications of this. Because you really see sort of, I make a sort of round loop, if you say, but an iterative loop. You will see. Okay. When you make a decision, you can say, okay, let's say you want to go for a job. Let's say if you want to become an editor or you want to become an academic. Let's say, and one is paid much better than the other, so there is an external criterion which might sort of push you into the one side rather than the other. Yeah? So that is usually often very the case, that we have decisions, or if you go on the market, okay, there are some apples here, they cost, let's say, £5, and some apples over there, they cost £6. So there's a clear external criterion. The ones are cheaper and the ones are expensive. But sometimes you have decisions where there's no external criterion. Like, let's say the payment for the editor versus, let's say, dentist. I know it's not a likely scenario, but editor, dentist, exactly the same, the working hours, the payment, and so on and so on. Then the only thing which you can rely on is sort of your subjective preference. What do you prefer? What do you like, where you have more resonance, where you feel more emotionally involved? So then sort of you apply what we call internally guided decision making versus externally guided decision making. So, and obviously the criteria for external, like 5 or 6 pounds, the apples, obviously coming from the environment. The internal criterion can only come from yourself. Yeah? Whether you want to go to London or come to Ottawa in winter. Yeah? You're welcome. And so what we did, we compared these two because we wanted to see how the self, your sense of self, impacts your decision making. Yeah? And how subjective our decisions are. Maybe our decisions are not purely objective. And this is exactly what we could see. And you can see here, this is a comparison between externally and internally guided decision making. You can see in the disappeared. Here it is. You can see here is the externally guided decision making, like the apples 5 versus 6 pounds, and you can see mainly what we call lateral regions at the outer surface of the brain. You see these blue spots here, for instance here, for instance there, it's the outer regions of the brain. Whereas in the internally guided, let's say dentist versus editor, and everything is the same, apart from your subjective preference, you see again these sort of strong regions in the midline regions, very typical. So that strongly suggests that this is more guided by your sense of self. And that's exactly that we directly compared the two conditions, which we often do in imaging. So you compare externally versus internally guided. You see the lateral regions here, again sort of outer surface, and here you see in the medial surface the regions in the middle of the brain. So that strongly suggests that exactly as I wrote it here, it is often not purely externally or purely internally. These are ideal conditions which we think it is. But probably the brain is probably much more clever than we are. I know this is very paradoxical, but I can see it as a neuroscientist almost on a daily basis that I apply the wrong concept. I just said it in Italy, again, completely paradoxical results, and then, yeah, that makes sense if you take the perspective of the brain, not the one of the investigator. So what you really have is sort of a balance between internally, externally guided decision making, between the internal inputs from the brain and its resting state activity, and the external environmental input. And take this one. So when you see sort of, let's say, the brain is like us, it's lazy. If there are external criteria, like 5 versus 6 pounds, okay, no problem, then it goes with the external criteria. But if there are no external criteria, then the intrinsic activity might step in. This is what the results suggest in others, and take over and say, okay, here I provide you an external criterion, an internal criterion, because you have to make a decision. Yeah? This is also an evolutionary thing. I mean, imagine you're approached by a lion, you have to make a decision, run away or you want to be eaten. Yeah? And quick. Yeah? So this is very important. Ultimately, you have a balance. And we currently investigate the same thing, this balance, in patients with depression, clinical depression. Now, really, you have to see a psychiatrist. And they are completely, their decisions are not guided by external criteria. This is why you find these decisions so erratic, what they do. Because they're completely guided by internal. So here, in these patients, okay, the red might be just much higher. So it's ultimately a balance, and this balance can go into an extreme. Yeah. The other extreme is mania. You might have seen people who are very happy and completely hyper-aroused. And they also have to go to a psychiatrist after all. So you have no choice. So, yeah. And there, you probably have no impact anymore of the intrinsic brain activity, because they're completely, you see this, they're completely guided by external stimuli. They cannot detach themselves. Yeah? So this is, you can learn a lot from these questions. So, what does this tell? So there is the internal decision making that yourself is somehow involved. And you all know this. I mean, every decision, even the most objective one, there's a certain self-relatedness, personal relevance. There's sort of a subjective touch, if you want to say so. You cannot avoid it. Usually the brain it always puts in its own intrinsic activity. So the question is now really, how does the self converge with the brain and its intrinsic or resting state? So you see this, and I saw this in Italy, here at Brina. So this is my own creation. I'm not good in Italian, as you can see. Here so the question is, how do the two converge? Because your brain is always with you. I hope so. So your intrinsic activity of the brain is always with you. Cannot avoid it. But at the same time, you always experience that yourself is also always with you. Even when you change, when you get older, when you look into the mirror, oh God, how many wrinkles I have, you still feel a sense of self. So there's a certain temporal continuity. This has been by John Locke, philosopher in the 17th century. The problem of personal identity. It's a major problem. And so how is that possible? Now put this into an empirical context. Let's say you may need to put the concept of self into the context of the brain and its intrinsic activity. And that's exactly what we did. Remember the second view of the brain, the intrinsic view of the brain. When your car continuously moves in the garage. That's what I'm talking about. So the question is, what kind of information does this movement of the car contain? Is it relevant? Is it relevant for the car? Does it contain some information about the garage, about the environment? That's exactly the kind of questions we need to ask in the case of the brain. So what we did here, and this is one of the most paradoxical findings for me, in particular from a philosophical perspective, that we observed, and others confirmed that we observed an overlap, a strong neuronal overlap between self-related activity during personally relevant stimuli, remember the London picture, here, again, these midline regions, these are regions called perigenial anterior cingulate. This is this one when you say, oh God. And this is the posterior cingulate. This is here in the back, each time in the middle. You see the red one is the overlap. This is called the DMN, default mode network. This is basically indicative of high spontaneous activity changes in these regions. And you're completely confused. You say, come on. The self-related pictures of self, even my own name, is highly relevant to me. I hope so. Then it should induce the highest level of activity. Basically, your brain should explode of activity. That's what you would spontaneously assume. The most important, most activity should be. It's exactly the other way around. The picture from Ottawa, for you, will induce a lot of activity. The picture from London or your own name will not induce much activity change, if at all, in these regions. So that's very strange. So maybe the intrinsic activity somehow knows these self-related stimuli, because it had always been exposed. Your name, you heard it, I don't know how many million times. So what we did, we went from the level of brain imaging to the level of single cells. You can do this when you might have heard about that there are electrodes inserted into the brain, and for instance, depressed patients or Parkinson patients, and to stimulate the brain regions. And in collaboration with the neurosurgeons, before they do this, you can sort of test for the single cells activity and response to, for instance, the subject's own name, as here. See, here the S is the subject's own name, and the NS is obviously not the subject's own name. So it's another person's name. So, and what we did, you see on the right, you see sort of the response of one of these midline regions, here again, here right in front, to the own name. You see the zero on the right. It's basically where you start hearing your own name. And the little bar diagrams are basically the firing rates of your cells, of your neurons. And you do not see the spontaneous firing. You see prior to zero, you see some spontaneous activity. And then when the own name comes, no change. That's very strange. So basically, there's no change in activity, and you can see this is different when you're here. So this is, finally, the arrow comes back. Here you see spontaneous firing rates. And then the stimulus onset, and you don't see much change in the spontaneous firing. That is different. This is the old name, this is subject. Not is another name. And you see this is different for another name. Then we looked for another region. So this is again the subject's own name, another name. So this is the subcortical region. This was done in Parkinson's patients with the subthalamic nucleus, so the basal ganglia for the experts among you. And you can see here a clear response to the own name. Yeah? So here you see increased firing. So these midline regions somehow seem to contain some information about your own name. So they say, why shall I react? I already know that. Okay. So then we tested that further. So this is yet another, so that's it. Sort of prior to the stimulus. What we did here, if that is so, if the resting state activity contains certain information about yourself, it should basically be clear already prior to the onset of the stimulus or the picture how you will evaluate the pictures, whether high self or low self. So what we did, we presented certain emotional pictures where subjects had to judge whether it's high self or low self. And then we wanted to see whether the high self or low self judgment is dependent upon the resting state prior to the onset of the stimulus. Oh, you can see here. Yeah. So zero is again the onset of the stimulus. You can see it here. Okay. So you can see it here. Zero is the onset of the stimulus, and we measured here for the expert among you. This is local field potential, sort of another way of measuring the power of certain amplitude or frequency fluctuations. You don't need to understand the details. But what is important that you can see here, prior to zero, you already see a lot of red stuff in those stimuli which were just judged as high self, whereas low self you don't see the red stuff in the middle. So for the expert, I mean, this is the gamma frequency power, you see an increase prior to stimulus onset. And that means maybe there are some spontaneous fluctuations in your resting state. And that may predict the timing whether you experience that stimulus as high self or low self. So it's not only the stimulus itself which makes you decide whether it's personally relevant or not, but also your intrinsic activity. Yeah? So maybe at some days you might experience even the minus 40 degrees snowstorm picture from Ottawa as high self. This is basically the same thing. You can see again, this is the stimulus onset. Prior to, you already see in this gamma. What does this mean? This means that maybe our intrinsic activity has some information in yet unclear ways encoded or contained about your sense of self and what is relevant for you and what has been relevant for you in the past. This is not just a pure memory system. It's basically in the spontaneous activity. It's always already there. And with that intrinsic activity and that self-related information in that, you approach specific tasks. And this is basically maybe the external stimuli might then just trigger that self-related information. And then you have a certain sense of self. So usually we assume that maybe the self is caused by the stimulus, but maybe it's the intrinsic activity has a certain sense. And this has major implications on the conceptual level. So usually, and also this dents deeply into philosophy. So when you look into the concept of self in philosophy, it's usually considered the highest order concept. It's the highest pinnacle. You all know Descartes, I think therefore I am. It's the highest level of consciousness. Immanuel Kant says sort of the self-specificity. You use some strange terms like transcendental apperception, and you don't want to get into these German confusions, if you want to say so, because your tradition of philosophy is somehow different. Some have exactly said that. But let's pull all that apart. The self, and even in current concepts in philosophy of mind, the self is still considered the highest order thing. So it's sort of the bundle, the collection of all things, of all kinds of functions, let's say cognitive functions, sensory-motor, affective functions. And that makes up for the self. It's a meta-representation, where your own processes in the brain are again represented or represented again and again, and then somehow you have a sense of self. That's sort of the current as well as the past view of the self as a higher order. But when now, and if that is so, then you would say, you would associate the self with specific cognitive functions, like attention, episodic memory, autobiographical memory, and things like that. But then you would not expect it to be in the resting state. And that's exactly, sorry, that's what you have here. So here now you have a different view of the self. So that's what I think what these findings indeed imply. And that's also, so you see, and that resting state has apparently some kind of self-specificity. And we do a lot of research now on understanding this link, because I think it is essential to understand why we have this subjective mental features. Free will, consciousness, these are all subjective phenomena. Where does this subjectivity come? One of the candidates might be here. And with that, then you have all these cognitive, sensory-motor, affective functions, which you hear so much in current neuroscience about. And these are ultimately all sort of your self is all involved. I showed you at the beginning the decision making, how the self impacts your decision making. We have a whole set of studies where we show that your sense of self strongly impacts whether you experience certain stimuli as rewarding or not. So you see, if that is so, the self is everywhere. It's in your resting state, it's always somehow there, and it's always present. And I think that very much corresponds to our experience. It's always there, and you see in Italy, it's even in Milano, in the train station. Self-value seems throughout Italy. Okay, why is that relevant? Let me just very briefly, 2 slides about depression. When I mean depression, I mean the real serious depression which leads you to the psychiatrist. It's a beautiful quote by a psychologist. Let me just briefly read. She sat by the window, looking inward rather than looking out. Her thoughts were consumed with her sadness. She viewed her life as a broken one, and yet she could not place her finger on the exact moment it fell apart. How did I get to feel this way? She repeatedly asked herself. By asking, she hoped to transcend her depressed state. Through understanding, she hoped to repair. Instead, her questions led her deeper and deeper inside herself, further away from the path that would lead to her recovery. So this is a typical description of what psychiatrists call ruminations. And I'm sure sometimes when you're lack of sleep and very bad mood, you know some of them. We call this sort of an increase, and everything is focusing around the own self. We call it increased self-focus. If that is so, then you would expect that these patients have abnormal activity in exactly these midline regions, which contain this self-specific information. And that's exactly the case. They have abnormally increased resting state or spontaneous activity in these midline regions. And that is related to the increased self-focus. So it might, and the ruminations in depression. So if you understand this relationship better, you might get new ideas for better forms of diagnosis of particular therapy patients. Let me come to the second mental feature, which I want to discuss, is consciousness. I hope that you are all conscious sitting here. I have to look around now as a clinician. Yeah. What do I mean by consciousness? There have been basically as many definitions about consciousness as authors, for sure. Yeah. So when I mean of consciousness, you might have heard a little bit, it's a famous by Thomas Nagel, what it is like. So you have a certain qualitative experience. So you have a certain sense of boredom, and your boredom, maybe your neighbor can see it on your face, but she or he doesn't experience your boredom, fortunately or unfortunately. Yeah? For me as a speaker, it's at least good not to experience it. So, and the question, and this is basically what I mean by consciousness. Some others you might know that Bloch has spoken of phenomenal consciousness as distinguished from more cognitive forms of consciousness like access consciousness or higher order consciousness. So when I mean here is the pure experience. Why do we experience something at all? Could be just you just sit here like a machine and you don't have any experience at all. So basically subjective experience. What it is like, you have a first person perspective as distinguished from a third person observation. And the question, why is there consciousness rather than non-consciousness, is a metaphysical, closely associated with the mind. And this has been called in philosophy of mind the hard problem. David Sharp. Obviously there's also an easy problem I leave aside. So, and basically some of the predecessors basically already cut, where you learned, he basically said, why is there consciousness rather than unconsciousness? Since I'm a good German, I had to read a lot of Kant, I learned a lot. Kant provided a very interesting answer in response to one of your British fellows, David Hume. So he said that maybe the mind provides a specific input, and that is distinguished from the input of the environment, the pure extrinsic stimulus. And that input is essential for consciousness to occur. So if that is right, then consciousness does not come with the stimuli, it is assigned by the mind to the stimulus. Hume, at the opposite, said, this comes with the stimuli, pure association. Kant said, no, the mind might provide an input, and that input, he spoke about the categories, whatever that is, and that is necessary. Now when you put Kant, this is now real neurophilosophy, the way I conceive it, you put Kant and his mind into the context of the brain, in the empirical context of the neuroscience. And this is why I wrote this paper, and I wrote another book in German, as I showed you before, for the general audience. And then the question arises, what kind of input does the brain provide? It's the intrinsic activity, we have already heard a lot, and that intrinsic activity contains apparently some self-specific information. Yes? But why does this make consciousness? So it seems to be, it structures and organizes the stimuli in a certain spatial and temporal way. So basically, when you enter this room, this is a beautiful room, I really like this room. It's a beautiful geometry, design, it's really beautiful. The more I sit here, I probably have to go also to the back to see it from there. So basically you enter this room and you change. You experience changes. Yeah? Because you're suddenly in a larger spatial temporal framework and your consciousness changes. So if you enter just in a very small room, you have a completely different sense of self and experience yourself in a different context. Same with the stimuli. The stimuli seem to enter a certain spatial temporal structure, coordinate system, or design if you want to say so, in the brain. And that is necessary, this integration is necessary for them to become conscious. If they're just purely mechanically processed, just without interacting, let's say you're so tired, you just don't want to see anything, you just don't recognize this room, you're basically almost in an autistic position in this room, you're not affected by it. If the stimulus is not affected, no consciousness. Now I'll show you some data. Okay. Theoretically, this is what I did in these 2 volumes, which came out this year. I don't want to read them because particularly the second one is 500 pages. So. But this is what I try to sort of say. It's an intrinsic activity view can explain different phenomenal features of consciousness. And here I indicate that it is really, that was too fast. Yeah. It is really sort of a certain spatial temporal structure, a virtual. It's like your software of the computer is a certain virtual spatial temporal structure, something which you cannot observe in a purely physical or Newtonian terms, if you want to say so. Yeah? And it is this virtual spatial temporal structure which the brain creates and continuously constructs. I'll show you some data. So what happens if you lose that structuring activity? So you can test this in patients with vegetative state. Vegetative state means if you're not conscious, you have no level of arousal, no consciousness. Prominent examples are recently, you might have heard Ariel Sharon, the former Prime Minister of Israel, who died recently. He was 5 or 6 years in a vegetative state or in a coma. And another one is the German countryman Michael Schumacher, Formula 1. It doesn't mean that I'm a Formula 1 fan. But these are examples. So we investigate these patients. And we investigate their resting state activity, as well as, you'll see later, how they respond to their own name, separately. So here you see, we really try to converge the different lines. So here this is a comparison picture between vegetative state patients and healthy subjects. You see different kinds of measures. This is pure resting state, just people lie in the scanner, eyes closed, and don't do anything. And you see different measures. FC means functional connectivity, basically how two regions communicate with each other. And ALF basically means variability. And I want to focus your attention on the variability. So variability, what does it mean? Your resting state is a very dynamic state. It constantly changes, like me. It constantly walks, changes its position, it walks back and forth. I need moving, otherwise I can't talk. So, yeah, and that's exactly. And sometimes I walk a little bit faster, and sometimes I walk very slow. So I walk in different frequencies. Same with the neural activity of your resting state. Sometimes it has certain passages where it walks very fast, high frequencies, then it walks very slow, but with long cycle durations, long steps. Okay, I know the example is not good, but anyway, I hope it somehow illustrates what the brain does, or what I think it does. And this variability, and you see again, this is again the middle of the brain. This is a comparison between healthy subject and vegetative state patient. You can see again, particularly in these middle regions where you have high spontaneous activity, there's a difference between these two groups. And then we also looked for different frequency bands. This is now specific focus on the variability. So sometimes I walk a little bit faster, sometimes slow, a little bit mixes. So I'm somehow variable in my different frequencies the way I walk. if I always do this, you probably get tired too, like me. I'm not variable. I'm not flexible. And that's exactly what seems to happen in these vegetative state patients. They are not variable anymore in the resting state. And you again see this in the midline regions and also in particular very low frequency domains. This is low 5, it's about 0.001 hertz. So it's extremely slow with very long cycle duration. You can see this here again. I indicated that frequency range, so it's very long snaps and they're absolutely not variable. So it's basically, if you want to say so, it's the very basement of the brain. The very basement, deep down there where you rarely go. But the basement is very important. If your basement is fragile, the whole thing might crumble. And that's exactly seems to be the case. You see here, DOC means disorders of consciousness, and MCS means minimally conscious state, VS vegetative state. You see here on the left, this is very slow frequency range, the variability is extremely decreased. Meaning, keep yourself variable, you might keep your consciousness. So, this has, now the question is, how is this related to the findings about the self, which I showed? Briefly go into philosophy, because this raises the question of how are self and consciousness related to each other. When you look into the history of philosophy, like Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Kant, all my representations should be accompanied by the I think. Current theories of consciousness, like self-consciousness, usually, or self, usually presuppose consciousness. So self is always tied intimately to consciousness. I mentioned here some authors, also in phenomenological philosophy, Husserl, Dan Zahavi is the current one, is usually, and then you would expect that basically the loss of consciousness necessarily entails the loss of self. So now, that might be one way where neuroscience could step in. We can investigate maybe in these patients, the vegetative state patients, the own name or some autobiographical events, and see whether they show some difference between self and non-self, or own name, other names, neuronally, and then see how that is related to consciousness. That's exactly what we did. I'll show you one of the more recent studies. We did this in China. So we asked the relatives for certain autobiographical events, and then we presented that auditorily via headphones in the scan. And obviously, we presented a non-self-referential question, as you can see here below, is 1 minute 60 seconds. And trust me, that's a transcultural thing. And then we compared these two conditions. And the first thing we looked whether they show some activity in auditory cortex. Auditory cortex is here, is basically the sensory region in the brain which specifically processes auditory stimuli. So I hope while I talk, your auditory cortex is very active. Also your visual cortex. Yeah. And you can see these are the single subjects. You see what you see also, you see huge brain lesions. It's really quite dramatic. And you see these red spots is the typical auditory cortex. It's basically here. This is where your auditory cortex is based. And you see in most of the subject, you see some processing of the stimuli. So that means they somehow, despite the absence of consciousness, they somehow can make the difference between self and non-self. How about the midline regions? And we did a comparison picture between healthy and patient. You can see this here. And for self versus non-self. And again, what showed up? Our beloved midline region. You see the difference between self and non-self. You can see this down here in the bar diagrams. Is somehow decreased in the patients, but some of them still can make the difference. So it's not that they cannot make a neuronal difference. But apparently this neuronal difference does not translate into phenomenal or experiential difference. Let me show you here. So now you want to know, after this, how is this related to the resting state? after I told you that the resting state contains some self-specific information. So you would expect that maybe the pure resting state, let's say, you remember the variability, the very slow frequencies, should predict the degree of activity during this autobiographical stimuli. That's exactly what we observed. On the left here, you see the variability. Here you see the non-self, self, non-self, task-evoked activity, variability, resting state, self, non-self. And you see the more variable, the better you are able to distinguish between self and non-self. You roll it. Now you say, yes, all nice and good, but what I really want to know, whether that is related to the level of consciousness. Next. This is what we show here. So here you see that the better you are able to distinguish between self and non-self, the higher your degree of consciousness. So this is very relevant. And we are the only ones who could show this because we are the only ones who use self-related stimuli. If you use pure cognitive tasks, you do not see this relationship between consciousness. So basically what you have is your resting state variability predicts your task-evoked self-non-self difference, and that in turn predicts your level of consciousness. So we come to the last slides, some of the conceptual implications, and then I finish. So how do we imagine that consciousness comes about? So you start with your intrinsic activity, your resting state. Forget what I said about the excitation inhibition balance that goes into the biochemical. That is not so relevant for now. But what is important is on the right. That the intrinsic activity seems to contain some kind of self-specific information. And that can be lost. For instance, in schizophrenia. You remember the Jesus in the mirror in the morning. He apparently has a problem in his self-specific organization. And if you don't have this information, so imagine you recognize your own name no longer as your own name. Well, then you have a problem. Yeah? And that's exactly, and ultimately that affects your experience. And then you take on, I've seen Jesus, I have seen in China, I have seen Mao, I have seen Nefertiti, and they also behave like this. It's unbelievable. Yeah? So this is a very basic disturbance. And with that equipment of your brain, your intrinsic activity, its self-specific information, and its spatial temporal structure, this is basically just modulated by the external stimulus. And that in turn, you see the big red arrow, triggers a consciousness of external stimulus. And at the same time a sense of self, because there must be a subject to experiences. I probably should have made some arrows between these two. That has a long, this relationship has a long tradition in philosophical discussion. When you read Kant and other authors, there's a lot of philosophical implications. I don't want to bother you. So, what does this mean for the concept of consciousness? You remember, for the self I said, okay, usually the self is located up there, and I pulled it down there to the bottom, to the base. Same with consciousness. So usually what you have, in both neuroscience and philosophy, consciousness is conceived as a higher order cognitive functions. Many current neuroscientific theories of consciousness presuppose that. Tacit, not explicit. Like the information integration theory by Tononi, global workspace theory, just to name for some of the experts. And in philosophy of mind, the meta-representation, David Rosenthal, and so on and so on. Yeah. But the findings seem to speak a different language. They seem to suggest that you may have to say maybe consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, what it is like, the subjectivity, the possibility of experience, maybe somehow related to the intrinsic activity and its spatial temporal structure. And that in turn impacts, can be then surfaces in all kinds of other functions. And that makes sense, because any kind of, you do not just perform a movement, you have an action. The difference between action and movement is the presence or absence of consciousness. Vegetative state patients just do movement. They have no action, no goal-oriented action. The same with emotions, affective feeling, and cognitions. So you see how the empirical findings, and you started out with a different view of the brain. It leads us to different kinds of experimental designs. And then it also leads us maybe to reformulate some of the philosophical notions, like self. Let's go back to one of the most, at least as I would see, of course I have a subjective bias, one of the most prevalent questions in current philosophy of mind and also I think in neuroscience. Why is there consciousness rather than no consciousness? So why is this little camera, I assume it has no consciousness, so what makes the difference between the camera and me? So, and this has been called, as I said in philosophy, the hard problem. Why is there consciousness rather than consciousness? So this is a question that is predominantly in philosophy meant as a metaphysical issue. Why is there consciousness, existence and real rather than non-consciousness? Yeah? So this is about existence and reality, this is a metaphysical issue. But it's also an empirical issue. What are the kind of features in the brain that makes possible that there can be consciousness? So I don't want to go into detail of this, but I showed you that maybe the intrinsic activity and its self-specific information and spatial-temporal structure might be central for it. One of the measures, remember, the variability in different frequencies. And how that is related to self-specific information is something we're currently testing. Because if these low-frequency fluctuations, remember they're 0.0 very long, if they are relevant, you would assume it's basically like the basement, then you would assume that the self must be also somehow related to it. So this is something we're currently testing. So we do not look up there, we look in the basement. We don't go into 25th floor, we go into the basement of the brain and ultimately of our existence. So what does this mean for the methodology? So where is the adventure? Remember, the adventure in the title of this talk. And I think the adventure is a double one. The adventure is that you have a different view of the brain and you have different kinds of experimental designs which leads you to novel insights. So this is sort of the adventure in neuroscience, and it's very exciting. And on the other hand, the adventure is also in philosophy because it forces you to rethink some of the more traditional philosophical notions, and particularly often just tacitly made presupposition. We just assume it's higher order cognitive function, and then we look for some cognitive function and all kinds of things. So, what does this mean? We really need to link, from my point of view, neuroscience and philosophy in an intrinsic way. I show you we need to listen. Maybe Kant, I'm sure some of you know this quote, very famous, thoughts without contents are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. Translated into my concept, in my context, philosophy without science is empty. Science without philosophy is blind. So you see, I work with the empirical notions and on the conceptual side, on both. The new conceptualization of consciousness itself as a basic function leads me to new experimental designs, and then back and forth in an iterative way. Even more beautifully put, Alfred Whitehead, mathematician and philosopher, first in Britain and in the US. It's beautiful, I love this quote. The true method of discovery is like the flight of an aeroplane. It starts from the ground with particular observation, as in science. It makes a flight in the thin air of imaginative generalization, as in philosophy. And it again lands for renewed observation, as in science, rendered acute by rational interpretation. So let's do exactly this. Let's start from the airport, called brain, and fly from there into the thin air of philosophy and return to. Thank you very much.
High levels of empathy will have a skewed way of processing things as self-relevant and non-self-relevant?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately I would probably argue, I'm not aware of studies doing both. I would probably argue it's a balance. So what I called self versus non-self related probably could contain the balance between self-relatedness and empathy. And actually we do a lot of transcultural neuroscience because I'm 2 months per year in China. And there's a sense of self is much less individualistic than in the Western world. So I have been often to US, I lived 5 years in Boston, I was 5 years in Harvard, but now in Canada I really notice that even compared to Germany, the degree of individualism in the notion of self is much higher. It's unbelievable how much that penetrates the culture and it's major reverberation. Whereas, so it's basically it's the own self, the content of the own self, and the context within which the self moves, let's say also including the other, is secondary. Whereas, and we have that recent, and whereas in the Asian world, it's really different. So just let you give me an example very quickly. I have a student from Japan who was interested in the self, so he came because of that. And sort of we have a scale where we had a private and a public self measured. Whatever that, it doesn't matter. So then of course you would, as a Western, in particular as a North American, you would say, okay, there's sort of, and then I ask him, how can you visualize that? Yeah. So then I asked some other students, and the Canadians said, okay, we have sort of a box private self, and then you had an arrow to the public self, yeah, and horizontal, yeah. Oh, no. What he did first, he did a big circle, the Japanese guy, and that circle was public self. And the private self was a little circle within that. So it's exactly the other way. And you can see this. So people call this independent versus interdependent self. And you see, so ultimately what does it mean for the brain? They don't have a different brain. The brain functions according to the same principle. So basically what it means is the brain processes a balance between self and non-self, yeah? On the process mechanism. It's not that they have self or non-self region. It doesn't exist. It's metaphysics. Okay. I hope that answers.
Any more questions?
Dan Dennett claims or thinks that consciousness might be an illusion. And Sam Harris thinks that the self might be an illusion. What do you think of these statements?
Okay, let's start with the easy one, the self. Yeah. First, I would say Thomas Metzinger, I'm sure, is known too. Is the self an illusion? Depends on what you mean by self. If you mean by self a substance, a property, in the classical metaphysical philosophical sense, yes. It is an illusion to consider this, to conceive the self as a mental substance or property within the natural world. I have to be a little bit specific for the philosopher. Within the world we actually live in, / the natural world. That's an illusion. Maybe it is conceivable within a purely logical world. I'm not interested in it. But that's a typical world of philosophers. Yeah? And that's the notion of self Metzinger or Sam Harris go against. That implies also the logical world. Yeah? But I would argue you need to talk about the natural world. So if you say there is no self in the sense of a sense of self, but by sense meaning experience, my own name. Some of you may know the cocktail party effect. You're at a cocktail party in London, everybody is talking like crazy and you can't hear anything. And suddenly somebody there in the corner whispers your name and you hear it. Yeah? You have a sense of self. That I would not do. So when you saw how much I somehow oscillated, but somehow in my talk I often spoke of a sense of self. So my current state of the art, but of course it's also variable, is sort of you have some self-specific information somehow encoded in the rest of the state. How? I don't know. We're researching that now. And that is sort of actualized and triggered by some external stimuli or some internal strong changes during dreams, and then you have a sense of self. Yeah? So that is really sort of, if you want philosophically, it may be compatible with the process-based notion of self. You saw my reference to White. Yeah? But that's a different self. I would not say that's an illusion. I would strongly against it, also as a psychiatrist. because I see these disorders and I see the experience. So you see, I'm a strict phenomenologist. This is where I come in. Start from experience. This is where I'm coming from. And this is sort of, I think, rendered plausible by what I see in psychiatry and in neuroscience. Yeah. Consciousness. Oh, okay. It's a nightmare. Because you will see this in my volume 1 and 2, remember these 2 volumes. Because the discussion of consciousness is a morass. And you see all kinds of different concepts. And already we discussed it before, and the neuroscience and philosophers use different concepts. What the neuroscientists usually mean by consciousness is contents. Certain contents are conscious. Neural correlates of consciousness. That's the Kripke stuff and all the others. Much of it. Ultimately, Tononi information integration theory is about that. How can we integrate different stimuli or contents so that they become? You saw that my view of consciousness is different. Because I say, yes, stimulus integration, fine. It's basically the Humean tradition of association. This can be traced back to British empiricists. But I say, no, there's always a gap. Philosophers call this explanatory gap. You cannot account for the subjective. So where is the subjectivity coming from? You saw I take the opposite route. I don't start with the stimuli and the content. I start with the intrinsic activity and look for some kind of features which make it possible. And I think the data, at least tentatively, support that. Yeah. So that's sort of a more empirical notion of consciousness. But as you saw in my second to last slide, it strongly borders upon metaphysical issues. So meaning, what are the features in the brain that make possible or predispose the transformation of a purely, seemingly non-conscious neuronal state into a conscious? Yeah. So I hope I showed you some of them. So it borders, and that's borders upon the heart problem, and that's ultimately what I'm interested in this work doing in volume 2. Another notion of consciousness is more epistemological. Is consciousness a boundary condition of our knowledge? You could say, Northoff, go home, either to Canada or Germany. You cannot say anything about it, because you must presuppose any kind of notion of consciousness on your own consciousness. Yeah? And then consciousness is a boundary condition beyond which we cannot go. Yeah? It's, and that's a need I think has to be taken very seriously, and that's really an epistemological issue, an issue of knowledge, where we come to the borders of our knowledge. Kant, who will the phenomenal what? And I think that's where neuroscience can learn a lot from physics. They are much better aware of these boundary conditions, which are right at the interface between empirical, metaphysical, and epistemology. I didn't answer your question. I made a detour.
Does anyone else have any questions? No? I think that's it. I think we could.
Sorry, just one. I was wondering, you talked a little bit about your experiences with people who have depression or mania, and then how that affected their internal activity. Could you tell us if you had any other sort of disorders that were more interesting, perhaps as interesting, like multiple personality disorder, but that set to someone's internal activity or intrinsic activity?
Okay. Multiple personality is
well, it's just as an example, but something,
yeah,
some other ones.
Focus on schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, mania and depression. Because I consider these disorders to be the most basic to intrinsic activity. You see in the other disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder, multiple personality disorder, I'm not aware of imaging. There are a couple of imaging, you see some default mode network changes. But this is sort of a slightly higher level probably. You certainly see all these psychiatric disorders, resting state changes. Why and how completely unclear. Why and how they are related to the symptoms, absolutely unclear. This is a path we strongly pursue for these disorders. And probably you have, I mean, in the heart, you have all kinds of different kinds of disturbances of its electrical, the structure of its electrical activity, let's call it like this. The temporal structure of its electrical, you can have arrhythmia, you can have vascular things and all kinds of things. Yeah, you see I'm not a specialist. Same probably with regard to the rest of the thing. So this is, you have different kinds of features, physiological features. Each of these features might lead to different kinds of disorders. Simply trust me, we really don't know about this intrinsic activity. We have no idea about that. Yeah, this is the way it is. Thank you.
Any more questions? Well, I think we can all agree that it was incredibly mind-blowing. So, can you please